There is nothing wrong with this television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture.
It's me, the Prince of Personality, Bugsy!
What could possibly go wrong? A lot, unfortunately. A veteran of the Mascot Wars of the early 90s, Bubsy has been relegated to little more than an internet joke, but is this fate truly deserved? These days, as every developer and publisher seemingly scramble to create the next big battle royale game, one must recall a time when the 2D platformer was the face of video games and mascots their arbiter. On this unusual episode of DF Retro then, we're exploring the world of everyone's favorite mascot, Bubsy the Bobcat. The legacy of Bubsy and its creators perhaps runs deeper than you've ever imagined, and it is an abyss which we must explore today. From his first outing on 16-bit machines, and his appearance on portable machines to his rebirth in 3 dimensions and beyond, this episode is dedicated to all the Bubsters that have never lost faith. So join us as we dive into the world of Bubsy and his retro adventures in what is sure to be the most explosive episode of DF Retro to date. Nothing can prepare you for Bubsy Mania. So let's get started. The 90s, a decade of pure attitude. The Simpsons dominated the airwaves, Beavis and Butthead upset teachers around the country, kids ruled, parents drooled, slime was everywhere, and video games were dominated by colorful characters with plenty of attitude to spare. Welcome to the Mascot Wars, a time when every marsupial and rodent became the subject of boardroom meetings everywhere as publishers scrambled to create the next big thing. Bubsy is one such mascot, and at the time, he was more popular than you might think. While time would be difficult for the Bubster, some never lost faith.
I'm Audi. I am the World Heavyweight Champion of Bubsy the Bobcat and a Bubsy historian.
And believe it or not, there's quite some history behind Bubsy and its creator.
So to look at the origins of Bubsy, you really have to go back to the late 70s to mid-80s. You have to look at Michael Berlin, the visionary who created Bubsy. Now, Michael was instrumental in the text adventure genre. He had founded the Sentinel software in 1980, which he created the Cyborg, a very popular text adventure.
Following this, Michael made the jump to Infocom, creators of the Zork series, where he became an implementer, the Infocom name assigned to designers and programmers, on projects such as Suspended, a cryogenic nightmare. In 1985, though, Michael left Infocom to form Brainwave Creations with his wife, where they would produce titles until the late 80s when Michael accepted a producer role at a then smaller publisher known as Electronic Arts. One of the titles he produced just happened to be the first game developed by Naughty Dog. It wasn't the team's first creation, but it was the first to ship as a Naughty Dog title. But after a short stay at Electronic Arts, Michael was pulled away by Accolade, a small but reasonably successful publisher at the time, where he would work on titles such as Altered Destiny, a graphical adventure game with the spirit of a classic Infocom production. After 10 years of crafting adventure games though, Michael wanted to try something new. Thus he began his research into the world of platform games.
He would spend most of his days really playing all types of platformers, but especially Mario and Sonic. While playing these for up to 14-15 hours a day, really having nothing else to do, he would see that there's potential here to combine elements from both.
These lengthy play sessions were key to convincing his producer at the time that he had what it takes to develop a platform game. Before the project was greenlit, he was asked to prove that he truly understood what it is that made games like Sonic work so well. He succeeded. Now, before development kicked off, Accolade initially considered licensing Chester Cheetah of Cheetos fame for its new game. After all, the publisher was no stranger to licensed titles, especially in the sports arena, so it kind of made sense. But it's believed that Michael was not keen on the idea, so it didn't happen. So what were his takeaways from the competition at the time? Well, Mario is known for slower, exploration-driven gameplay with a focus on puzzle elements and challenging platforming, which rewards careful, skilled play. Sonic, on the other hand, is a much faster game with complex level design and unique movement systems that require some time to master. Both were extremely popular and served as direct inspiration during the creation of Bubsy.
So Michael was wondering, how do you combine these elements? Speed, exploration, technical platforming, fun for the whole family. Well, you put them all together, and what could possibly go wrong?
At first, not much. Believe it or not, Bubsy had an actual hype cycle behind it. There was genuine buzz around this new character.
Contrary to belief today, when we look back at Bubsy, it was actually a very popular release. In GamePro, EGM, they all hyped up this character. This is a character with attitude, with personality, something that was lacking a lot from, for example, Mario or Awesome Possum.
Bubsy finally released in 1993 to excellent reviews. It was praised for its visuals and cartoony premise. It wasn't a perfect game, but there was something to it. It's also an example of multi-platform game development gone right. Bubsy was first released on Super NES and Sega Genesis, and looking at the two side by side, it's one of the closest calls we've seen during this generation. The primary difference lies in color palette selection, where artwork takes on a slightly different hue on one system or another. The core sprite and tile work, however, is translated faithfully between each version. It's also worth remembering that Accolade shipped games with its own bespoke cartridge design on Sega's system. The initial version of Bubsy wasn't even licensed for play on Genesis, but after its success, Accolade received a proper license which later copies of the game would carry. Not that getting to that point was easy, since it involved a court case with Sega over non-licensed games. It was kind of a mess, but Accolade won in the end. Jumping into the game, there are some reasonably impressive visual effects on display. When you land on a water slide, for instance, the entire game screen can be inverted using this neat visual trick. Backgrounds, while somewhat grainy in appearance, feature line scrolling on both platforms, enabling additional depth in the parallax scrolling, something that was common on Sega's machine but less so on Super NES. Sprites are also large and well animated, while the frame rate is very stable. The soundtrack is somewhat less impressive, I suppose, than the visuals, with average compositions that don't really hold up. But I suppose it sounds suitably Saturday morning cartoon, so it works. The game is also packed to the brim with voice samples across both consoles, and the quality is surprisingly decent.
What could possibly go wrong?
Though slowing down Bubsy's voice is equally entertaining.
What could possibly go wrong?
Believe it or not, the game was even localized for Japan as Yamaneko Babaji no Daiboken, with new voice lines recorded in Japanese. But much of the game's reputation stems from its difficulty level. Bubsy is a very difficult game. Bubsy himself is fragile, and the game's high speed means lots of blind deaths. In that sense, it's not easy to pick up and play for the first time. Give it a fair shake though, and things start falling into place.
The key to mastering Bubsy is really the glide move, where you have to take your time, explore. This is really the true key to the game. It's exploring. These are huge worlds. It has an overworld, an underground, and a linear path left to right.
So Bubsy was very much a traditional platformer. It's a fun little game, and one that may have gone down as a solid B-tier platformer of this era, but unfortunately, Accolade wanted a franchise, and this is where things started going wrong. Who's that mascot? It's Awesome Possum!
I'm awesome!
Michael Berlin would not be asked back by Accolade to direct Bubsy 2. However, Cindy Kirkpatrick, a programmer for the first game, would come to direct the sequel. The sequel's idea was to make it more kid-friendly. Here was an idea to make Bubsy into a franchise that could potentially be made into a Saturday morning cartoon, merchandising, action figures, the whole lot.
And sure enough, Accolade got the marketing ball rolling. Sponsored by Taco Bell, Bubsy received a pilot episode for an animated series in late 1993 that ultimately didn't get picked up. Michael Berlin was no longer involved in the franchise at this point, and the episode's creators took plenty of liberties with its characters. Despite that, the animation is rather decent, and it features lots of notable voice talent from that era, including Rob Paulsen, Tress MacNeille, Jim Cummings, and more.
He means you have to be totally nuts.
Well, hey, I can handle it on both counts, guys. So, how does this puppy work?
Despite its failure though, Accolade continued working on a sequel, which finally released 1 year after the original on October 28, 1994. Who's that mascot? It's Glover!
Bubsy, Bobcat!
This, my friends, is where the Bubsy franchise crashed and burned. Bubsy 2 is a terrible game. While the first was a fun but challenging platform game, the second title is a technically inept experience with bad design and awful controls.
When looking at Bubsy 2, it's interesting to see how it really does differ from the first game. The first game, all about exploration. You had overworlds, undergrounds, and left to right, as we mentioned earlier. However, Bubsy 2 is much more of a maze-like, abstract, horrible game. And it does not work even within its own guidelines. The art direction is all over the place, really, with foreground elements not really sticking out, and the routes in the game not really being laid out by any indicators such as yarn balls, which have now been turned into marbles, and the enemies have all very different art styles. It's really an indicator that Bubsy 2's direction was not necessarily the most consistent.
So it's a mess then. The level design is confusing, it's packed with awful mini-games and shooting segments, and on both Super NES and Genesis it runs extremely poorly. The frame rate is unstable to the point where it rarely holds 60 frames per second, and during this era, failing to hit 60 in a 2D platform game was usually a sign of poor design and bad programming, something Bubsy 2 certainly has in spades. And for comparison's sake, yeah, the Super NES version runs even slower than the Genesis version. These shooting segments play horribly as a result of the pitifully low frame rate. The two versions are reasonably comparable then, but I feel like the visuals are less attractive than the first game. Background artwork is just too chaotic for its own good, and the stages have no sense of design. It almost feels randomly generated at points. Now this stage isn't too bad in terms of visual design compared to the rest, but honestly none of them play well. I also found that the music speed was inconsistent during gameplay, often slowing down and speeding up based on either the frame rate or movement speed. Either way, it's terrible. Bubsy 2 even features an actual Nerf gun, but your usual attack remains jumping on enemies' heads. Of course, that's not to say every new idea was bad.
A new inclusion to Bubsy 2 is the life bar system, where Bubsy's face in the corner will deteriorate as you take damage. This is actually an idea from Michael Berlin after the first game that he wanted to implement in his sequel, so some of his ideas were actually implemented.
But if you thought Bubsy 2 was bad on consoles, you haven't seen anything yet. Who's that mascot? It's Sonic the Hedgehog!
Yes!
That's right, Bubsy 2 was released for Nintendo Game Boy as well. And while it's true that I took the time to illustrate this fantastic border when playing the game on Super Game Boy, the fact is Bubsy 2 does not deserve this masterpiece. It's worse than I had ever imagined. Now, I'm a big fan of the Game Boy, to be honest, and there are some magnificent looking games in the system that really push boundaries. I mean, just look at this, it's remarkable. Bubsy 2, however, is the complete opposite. Firstly, it's ugly. The visuals are designed in an almost inverted fashion compared to typical Game Boy titles. The backgrounds are drawn using the darkest shades, while the foreground is bright. This is a terrible combination for original Game Boy games on an original Game Boy screen, which leads to extra ghosting. The frame rate is even less stable than the console versions as well, regularly ping-ponging between 30 and 60 FPS, creating a sense of jerkiness that pervades the entire game. While many of the concepts from the console version are present here, the number of stages is relatively limited in comparison. It's a very short game, which in a way is kind of a blessing. But if you thought 3 Bubsy games in 1994 wasn't quite enough, well, thankfully, there's one more for you. Who's that mascot? It's Mario!
Mario's Smash and Dash.
Yes, Bubsy is also available on the Atari Jaguar, and this is a strange one. For one thing, there aren't a lot of 2D platform games available on the Jag, so I did take an interest in this while building my Jaguar collection. Bubsy and Fractured Furry Tales is a strange mishmash of concepts from Bubsy and Bubsy 2 then. It's more focused on genuine platforming compared to the second game, but it features some of the most nonsensical enemy and platform placement I've ever seen. Right from the start, you get the impression that object placement was given no real thought. Rather than constructing the level from world tiles, for instance, many platforms are just random objects suspended in midair. Like the original game, Bubsy can still die in one hit, but enemy placement is much worse here. At times, it's difficult to even tell what's an enemy and what's a platform, and with the speed of movement, it's just a constant barrage of blind deaths. It's honestly one of the most frustrating platform games I've ever played, and just not fun at all. It also fails to utilize the Jaguar hardware in any meaningful capacity. Background scrolling is simplified compared to other titles in the series, with a single, flat parallax background used for each stage, while the visuals fail to offer any real advantage over the 16-bit machines of this day. It simply isn't a showpiece for the system, but hey, at least it runs at 60 frames per second, so there's that. Now, while it may seem that way, this is not the end of 2D Bubsy games, however. There's still one other title. Who's that mascot? It's Mean Yob!
What are you looking at?
Yes, Super Bubsy for Windows 95. That's right, in 1996, Bubsy received his very own PC conversion. This is, without a doubt, one of the least common boxed PC games I've run across, and a game that few even seem to know exists. And to top it off, it was developed by ATI, or as they're known today, AMD. So yeah, it's a neat release. You see, unlike most console to PC conversions of 2D platform games, Super Bubsy utilizes high-resolution 640 by 480 artwork. It features more than 4 times the pixels of its console brethren, and looks dramatically better as a result. Now, this isn't always the case, and great pixel art is typically designed for the target screen resolution, but in the case of Bubsy, it really feels as if it was always meant to run at this higher resolution. The PC version also features a CD audio soundtrack, which unfortunately just sounds like MIDI, which is also an option. The game also features a fully voiced narrator, both during the introduction and between each stage.
Who will defend us in our hour of need from such an unseen?
It even includes the full pilot episode of the cartoon right on the disc. The only problem with this version lies in the difficulty I had running it. I don't have a PC from exactly the era this was designed for, and thus even on an 18-year-old system with Windows XP, it just doesn't run correctly. Still, it's neat that it exists, and when running properly at least, it's probably the best version of Bubsy ever made. Unfortunately, it was quickly followed up with perhaps the series' most infamous game, Bubsy 3D. Who's that mascot? It's Airzonk!
TurboGrafx 16.
Bubsy 3D is perhaps the game which ultimately ruined the name Bubsy. But is it really that bad? Well, yes and no. But what's most interesting about this one is where it came from and how it started. Basically, Michael Berlin returned to work with Accolade on this project, but only under one condition, that they could do the game in 3D. Now, when development began, 3D platform games didn't really exist in any meaningful way. Super Mario 64 hadn't been released, nor had Crash Bandicoot. Jumping Flash had just hit the market, but there wasn't really a solid model for how to approach platforming in 3 dimensions. Michael did say later in an interview that upon seeing Mario 64 for the first time as development on Bubsy 3D neared completion, well, he knew they were screwed. But that doesn't mean there aren't some interesting elements at play here. For one thing, Bubsy 3D is the first game from Eidetic, a new studio formed by Michael and former Infocom colleague Mark Blank. If you aren't familiar with Eidetic, this is the studio that would go on to develop the Siphon Filter series for Sony and are currently finishing up Days Gone for PlayStation 4 under the title Bend Studio. The game itself is rather fascinating as well. The approach to 3D used here is somewhat unique for the system. Bubsy 3D runs using the PlayStation's high-resolution interlaced mode, so it's sharper than most PS1 games from this era, especially on a CRT. The team focuses more on flat-shaded polygons with limited texture use. At the time, this looked extremely dated and is likely why so many people slam the visuals. These days, however, honestly it holds up better than many other games from that era. Bubsy 3D almost completely escapes the typical affine warped texture look you get on the PlayStation, and it kinda works. There's even dynamic music here where enemies contribute to the score, kinda like New Super Mario Bros., which would release a decade later. Unfortunately, beyond that, there isn't much to it. The controls are of the tank variety, similar to Tomb Raider on paper, but without the grid system to rein things in, so it feels sluggish and difficult to control. The stages are confusing and not especially well designed, though I do appreciate how the camera angles down when jumping in conjunction with a shadow to help platforming. Everything else though feels off. Even still, I think this is a better game than Bubsy 2 in just about every way imaginable, and it isn't nearly as awful as its reputation would lead you to believe. But following its release, Bubsy all but disappeared from the eye of the public. That is until one interesting day in 2013 when a certain browser game appeared. Bubsy 3D, Bubsy Visits the James Turrell Retrospective is a bizarre indie tribute to Bubsy, at least in some ways, that sends this crazy bobcat into the mouth of madness. You start in what appears to be a world inspired by Bubsy 3D before descending into this pure insanity, and it's awesome. Is it art? I think the only honest answer is yes. Yes, it is. It's also been re-released in downloadable form, forever preserved for gamers around the world. And for a while, this became the face of Bubsy as a whole. Well, there was this too.
These are some secrets on the second level of Bubsy 3D. I know this game extremely well, but in order for it to even start, I need to get to the area. While I'm getting there, I'm collecting some junk along the way, bopping a few enemies, hopping these platforms, and I think you got the idea.
Which was awesome. But hey, Bubsy did however receive a new game in recent years and has another one in the works, but it's fair to say that this mascot has one of the strangest legacies in gaming today.
Over time, Bubsy has really become the example of the bad mascot. I feel this is a little bit misguided. At the time of release, Bubsy was really a popular character and people were hyped. He was actually the most hyped character of 1993. Go check it out. After this, the sequels would really ruin Bubsy's reputation with Bubsy 2, Bubsy's Fairy Tale, and yeah. But if we go back to the original Bubsy and give it another chance, take it slow, explore, and master the game, I think you will have some fun. Bubsy is your friend, he is not your enemy.
But that is the end of this tour of insanity. I hope you've gained a newfound appreciation for Bubsy on this April 1st, or whenever you opted to watch this crazy video, and will now go purchase every Bubsy game ever made, well, except Bubsy 2 and Bubsy 3D, and honestly they're mostly bad, except for Bubsy 1. And if you did manage to reach the end of this tribute to the greatest mascot the world has ever known, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell for more Bubsy, and find me on Twitter to tell me how awesome Bubsy is. And until next time...
What could possibly go wrong?